Welcome back to this YouTube channel where I'm one-on-one in conversation with India's best-selling author Ashwin Sanghi. Ashwin, in the previous episodes we saw about your patterns of writing and especially about Chanakya's chant and my favorite book, 13 Steps to Bloody Good Luck. In the last 10 years or so, something fundamentally has changed in the Indian publishing industry. If you look at the space 10-15 years ago, the best-selling list, 8 of them could be foreign authors and probably somewhere towards the end 2 Indian. That's changed, probably 8 of them are Indians and 2 of them are probably foreign authors. Number one question is that why is it that the Indian readers are accepting more of Indian writers and authors? Second is that do we somewhere have a major role to play, or did we play a major role in this fundamental shift?
Okay. Let me tell you rather what my understanding of the situation is. If you had looked at this market maybe 10 years ago or a little more than 10 years ago, the truth is that the average publisher was not looking for the next Radhakrishnan Pillai or for the next Ashwin Sanghi or for the next Amish Tripathi. They were not looking for that. They were either looking for award-winning fiction, which meant that you were the next Booker winner. Or they were looking for simply the stuff which Indians were expected to write, which meant, in other words, a family saga or a historical something like, for example, Jewel in the Crown. That type of stuff is what we were looking for from Indian authors. In fact, when I went out searching for a publisher for the Rosabal line, they said a thriller, a theological thriller written by an Indian, an Indian who's a Marwadi, you've got it, you've lost it. You've lost it. So that was really the cultural context in which we were operating. So my gut tells me that it's not that the Indian reader was not accepting of Indian authors. 10 years ago, it's just simple that what was out there on the book stands was simply foreign authors. It wasn't Indian authors. That began to undergo a change because of the publishing industry. And I would give a great deal of credit in this to someone like Chetan Bhagat, who made it fashionable for a mass audience to start reading English. And I think with that, we saw a transition happening within the publishing industry where they said, oh, this can become an interesting market. Because really think about it, you already had writers in Hindi who were selling in lakhs. You had the Surendra Mohan Pathaks, whose every novel used to sell a lakh or two very easily. So Hindi pulp was very much there. You just needed to go to the railway station and you got it. But till then, you didn't have an Indian author in English who could sell in those numbers. That changed post Chetan. I would say that subsequent to that, the change that also started happening was the demographic. Till then, you had a much more mature audience reading books. Suddenly, you had this huge youth population because, as you know, India is one of the youngest countries in the world. So suddenly you had this youth population which was exploding. A large chunk of this youth population was also the diaspora outside India. And that diaspora was disconnected from its own roots. They were yearning for a connection to someone who was talking in an Indian voice, talking about Indian issues, talking about Indian characters, speaking in the way that they speak, and also bringing them in touch with their own history, with their own mythology, with their own theology, with their own culture. That yearning for a back to roots was very much there. I think if you take the combination of these two things, the changing demographic and the changing publishing world, these two things pretty much explain what we have now observed, that why has the bestseller list gone from 8 foreign authors and 2 Indians to 8 Indians and 2 foreign authors. That explains it.
Ashwin, continuing the same line of thought, we see that even within the English Indian best-selling authors, there's a lot of Indian historical, mythological, traditional elements to it. So if you look at Devdutt's books, your books like Krishna's chant, Krishna's key, Chanakya's chant, even Rosabelle line for that particular matter, from different cultures and all.
Correct.
Even Chanakya, corporate Chanakya. So, or the other hundreds of books on Ramas and Krishnas, Amish is doing that.
Yes.
So, is there any traditional or any other connect that is also connecting to the youth, which is very Indian?
Well, I would say that what has changed, and I would give a lot of credit to Amish for this, is that he has made mythology fashionable.
Fashionable, yeah.
So to that extent, there was a time where if you wanted to be a reader, it was taken for granted that you were going to be a reader of a mystery.
Yes.
You could be a reader of detective novels, spy novels, but reading mythology, oh God, there was something wrong with you.
Yeah.
If you wanted to be reading mythology.
Right.
I think that is what Amish has successfully done.
Sure.
And so to that extent, I think it has opened up the floodgates of people wanting to do reinterpretations of mythology and maybe possibly some of the historical stories. My personal view is that there is nothing wrong with that.
Yes.
Because in our own country, we have had hundreds and hundreds of versions of our most famous myths.
Yes.
To think about it, I mean the Mahabharata that today we call the Mahabharata started out as something which was 25,000 verses of the Jaya, morphed into 50,000 verses of the Bharat, and then morphed into 100,000 verses of the Mahabharata. Tells you how much got added in subsequent years. And when we talk about someone called Sage Vyas writing the Mahabharata, you know for a fact that there must have been multiple Sage Vyasas over many hundreds of years who eventually created that work. The same thing applies even with the Ramayana, that you have more than a couple of hundred versions of the Ramayana, and each one of them has a different spin on the story. I came across one of the versions of the Ramayana in which Sita plays a vital role in the elimination of Ravan and eventually manifests as Durga. So each one has a different spin on it, and that's what makes our mythology so interesting. So I think I wouldn't even call it a sudden reawakening or a sudden reawakening of interest in mythology. That has always been there. I think what has changed is the fact that now we are in a position to once again revive the tradition of retelling.
Wow.
That has changed. Think about this, Radha. In the old days, I mean, how most of our myths and our Vedas and our ancient books go back thousands of years.
Yes.
On the other hand, the writing system, you know it because you've studied the Mauryan period much more closely.
Yes.
But the Brahmi script actually happened around the Mauryan time.
Yes.
That only goes back to about 300 BC.
Right.
Now, in other words, some of these ancient documents, like for example the Vedas, which have been there from, let's say, roughly 2,500 BC. That means for a large amount of time, these were stories which were being verbally recounted from one to the other.
Right.
Without the writing system.
Right.
And as you know, what goes out from a circle in a Chinese whispers game is not the same as what went in. By the time that it has done that full round, there has been another twist added to that story. I think that was the fundamental tradition of India. And I think we are simply keeping that tradition alive. So I'm happy to see that happening.
In fact, Ashwin gave a lot of dimensions that storytelling was also a form of knowledge dissemination in our country.
Of course.
From grandparents to grandchildren, it goes on. Today we are just giving it a book form. It exists within our culture and our tradition.
And partly the reason for that is because our families have changed.
Yes.
For example, I'm sure that when you grew up as a kid, there must have been either a grandparent or a dada, dadi, nana, nani, someone or the other who would have been telling you stories. When I grew up, I had my grandmother who used to tell me stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. My nana, on the other hand, was a person who never used to tell me mythological stories, but he would always tell me stories that used to scare the hell out of me. You know, about ancient rituals happening on the banks of a river, or a story that plays out inside a Sunsan cemetery of some sort. And I think the two combined themselves in a way which I didn't know that it was playing such an important role in terms of my future thinking process.
Right.
So to my mind, what has changed is the fact that families are now so much more nuclear. The parents usually both are working. And very often they just by the time the day ends, they don't have time to sit with their kids and tell them stories. So there have to be new ways of making those stories reach these kids.
In fact, you told about a very important word, which is future. Today's present activities that we do on Twitter, writing a lot of books, is going to be definitely different when we do that in the future. Before we go into the next episode where I'm going to touch upon it, I hope everybody is already following Ashwin on his Twitter, on his Facebook, his YouTube channel. But also make sure you read his books because they're absolutely brilliant. I'm a fan of yours. So in the next episode, we are talking about the future ideas, the books that you already written, and probably explore that from different dimensions. This is Radhakrishnan Pillai signing off this particular episode one-on-one in conversation with Ashwin Sanghi. But the next episode, the last episode in this particular series, is going to be very insightful because it's all about the future. See you next soon.